lovely atoll set in the equatorial central Pacific, now capital of the new island nation of Kiribati, Tarawa was part of the British Gilbert and Ellis Islands Protectorate in the years before World War II. Under the benign parental guidance of the Colonial Administrative Service, life continued at an unhurried pace, much as it had since the original settlers reached Tarawa's shores over 3,000 years ago. This was the Tarawa of distant memory, a lonely, peaceful atoll set in the vastness of the equatorial Pacific. Its huge lagoon, surrounded by a necklace of palm-fringed coral islets. It's here on this seemingly innocent island where a group of young Marines were put to the ultimate test of courage. 45 years later, the survivors are returning. They're senior citizens now, after productive years fulfilling the American dream. Some white-collar professionals, others blue-collar workers. From the valleys of Virginia to the plains of Texas, from the rural roots of Georgia to the frantic freeways of California, they've gathered for this journey into the past. This awakening of long-suppressed memories of horror and heartbreak dredged from the dark recesses of their minds. For as young men, almost a half-century ago, they survived a test of fury and fire unequaled in modern warfare. They are a band of brothers. They were Marines. And they've made this journey to dedicate a monument to their comrades who fell in the Battle of Tarawa.
The trip was great. It's a lot of emotions after 45 years, and seeing these people waiting for us here is just kind of nice to see. A little different than 45 years ago, isn't it?
Well, at least they're not shooting at us.
During the Tarawa battle, the natives had been evacuated to other atolls or had fled to other islands surrounding Tarawa's lagoon. And now, a half-century later, they were able, for the first time, to express their thanks to the men who had freed their precious homeland from the Japanese. On day 2 of their return to Tarawa, the 2nd Marine veterans board sightseeing flights for their first view of Basho Island. Below, the battleground of their youthful combat comes into view, and the Marines are lost in memories seared into their minds, now brought to conscious reality. Red Beach 3, still no sign of the carnage of 45 years ago. Viewed from ground level, Basho still reveals signs of the savage conflict. On Takaranga Point, 2 coastal defense guns still point seaward, and the rusted debris of war litters the beaches of Basho.
Knocked the snot out of these. Boy, that other one down there, they really pounded.
Can you imagine if they put one down the barrel of that thing, we had one on the same angle coming in?
Oh yeah, they hit it like more than once.
Red Beach 2. Here the fighting was heaviest of all. The white sands and inner reef are covered with expended shells, wrecked tanks, rusted Amtraks, and grounded landing craft. Amid the remains of war, a Sherman tank lay stranded on the beach. Now a resting place for seabirds, the old tank is a memory marker to the returning veterans who recall the same tank in the same position 45 years ago. date, November 20th, 1988. 45 years to the day of the Tarawa attack. The 2nd Marine Division veterans gather in Beisho's town square to dedicate a monument to their fallen comrades. The young Marines who raised the flag on a shattered coconut tree stump in 1943 now salute the colors once again, and for the last time on the shores of Beisho.
We will ask our colors to again take position, and 2 of our members will affix the battle streamer for the presidential unit citation to the colors of our division. And this time the streamer will be affixed on the battleground where it was won.
And now, Lieutenant General Edwin J. Godfrey, commanding officer of the Fleet Marine Force Pacific, lays a wreath at the Tarawa Monument in memory of the 1,113 killed and 2,290 2nd Division Marines wounded in the Beisho Battle.
Old soldiers fall in to pay tribute to their fallen comrades. What kind of an experience can bring back such vivid memories to these battle-hardened veterans? It's not hard when you consider that most of these men were mere boys when they stormed the beaches of Tarawa. 69-year-old islander Rota Honorio remembers the night in 1940 when this lovely backwater British colony was rudely wrenched into the 20th century.
I remember that time when 2 Japanese warships came to Tarawa. They landed their troops on the island of Beisho, and the natives then were so disturbed during their sleep, and they didn't know where to flee to. They didn't know where the trouble was. Only a shout among the natives, "The Japanese are here, have landed." And they just flew to all parts of Beisho, not knowing where the real danger was. During that visit of theirs, they went ashore, they destroyed every possible floating craft they could lay a hand on, including the small, precious canoes of the locals.
A year later, the Japanese were back, and under the command of Rear Admiral Tomonari Saichiro, they began to turn the islet of Beisho into an impregnable fortress. With the aid of Tarawan and Korean laborers, an airfield was constructed, protected by tank traps and rifle pits, interconnected with a network of trenches. Huge ferro-concrete bomb-proofs and blockhouses were built. along with strategically placed pillboxes with interlocking fields of fire. On the very day that the Japanese returned to occupy the Gilberts, another island was to feel the effects of the Japanese war machine. The date was December 7th, 1941. The island was Oahu in the Hawaiian chain. It was Japan's intention to protect its expanding empire by neutralizing America's ability to wage war and will to fight. But the Pearl Harbor attack had the opposite effect, as millions of young Americans rushed to recruiting offices to sign up.
Of course, like most young Americans of my era, the decision to go in the Marine Corps came at Pearl Harbor. And I enlisted in the Marine Corps on December 8th, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor. And I don't think I was quite 20 years old. I was 19, and I was in my second year of college when President Roosevelt declared war. And I just left college and went down to the recruiting depot and signed up.
By June of 1942, the United States Marine Corps had filled its ranks from a pre-war strength of 17,000 to 143,000 men, and convoys were formed to transport the 1st Marine Division to Wellington, New Zealand. Here, the troops received additional training, and mountains of supplies were assembled to support the first strike against the Empire of Japan. By the end of July, a task force steamed into South Pacific waters, reinforced by elements of the 2nd Marine Division. On August 7, 1943, the 2nd Marines made the first assault against an enemy position in World War II as they struck the Solomon Islands of Florida, Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo, the beginning of the Battle for Guadalcanal, a struggle that would last 6 months and cost the Marines 1,152 dead and 2,799 wounded. But it was just a prelude to what lay ahead, the Battle for Tarawa, one 291-acre dot of land in the remote equatorial Gilbert Islands. In August of 1943, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki assumed command of the Tarawa defenses. His assignment? To fulfill a plan called Yogakai, meaning the waylaying attack. The Imperial General Headquarters wanted to demonstrate to the Americans the folly of attempting to attack Japan's island empire. Under Shibasaki's direction, the water defenses were strengthened with the installation of an offshore maze of concrete tetrahedrons, barbed wire, and underwater mines. On shore, Admiral Shibasaki armed his defensive positions with 62 heavy and 44 light machine guns. 14 light tanks were dug into the sand, their 36-millimeter cannons pointed seaward. A formidable arsenal of artillery awaited an attack. 6 70-millimeter battalion guns, 8 75-millimeter dual-purpose guns, and 10 mountain guns were concealed in concrete and coconut log bunkers. 4 5-inch dual-purpose guns, 6 80-millimeter guns, and 4 5.5-inch coastal defense guns were sighted in along pre-selected fields of fire. And to top off this incredible array of firepower, 4 8-inch coastal guns were mounted at each end of the island. To man these defenses were 4,836 elite Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces troops, battle-hardened veterans of the Asian campaign. According to the Japanese, Beisho's defenses could withstand assault by 1,000,000 men for 1,000 years. Unfortunately for thousands of American and Japanese soldiers, a test of that theory was only days away. In October of 1943, the 2nd Division Marines boarded transports at Wellington, New Zealand.
I think we was 39 days on those transports going to Tarawa, so we was busy keeping equipment up, keeping in physical shape. They made sure you was busy all the time. You didn't have a lot of free time on the transports, and we practiced one landing going through the New Hebrides, And then as the convoy gathered after we left New Hebrides, then we realized we was going to a big operation, because at that time we had the biggest convoy that had assembled in the Pacific. And then as we got closer, they got the maps out, and you got to see the map of where you was going and what part you was going to be and what your battalion is going to do and what your company is going to do, right down to the platoon. So we kept busy. That you got a lot to do.
And after we left the New Hebrides, then the troops were told where we were headed, which was Tarawa Atoll and Batio Island in particular. And of course we were told that Batio Island was less than a square mile, so we were quite sure that it would take maybe a half a day to whip the Japanese defenders there.
Colonel Crow, who was the commander of the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, had all of us in different groups down into a room and given us a briefing, and he expected only to need 2 Marines, one with a piece of chalk and one with a bayonet. One Marine would mark a circle on those that were still staggering, the other Marine would finish them. That was Colonel Crow's suggestion of how the operation was going.
This was my first battle that I was in. And being green as I wasn't really scared, and because the Navy told us that they was probably going to send us ice cream in there at 10 o'clock that morning. Of course, we never got the ice cream.
We had been led to believe that we could go in and stake off our souvenir area, and that be a pretty easy deal.
Pretty much all the NCOs had been through combat on Guadalcanal, and I'd say probably 50% of the Marines in our company was combat guys from Guadalcanal. So when they told us we was going to have a good time or an easy time or a quick time on Tarawa, we thought, well, you hear this if you've been in combat before.
But the evening of the night before, of course, we had received a little mail in the New Hebrides, and among that mail was a letter from my mother, and she had included in that a scripture for me to read, and it had to do with a psalm that has to do with 1,000 shall die at thy right side and 1,000 at thy 10,000 at thy left, but nothing shall come near you. I also had my New Testament that I carried with me all the time, and the night prior to the Tarawa operation, I had seen it many times, but this time it came out, and I used it as my prayer. So let me tell you about this. Greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friend. And that's how I was going in, because I had no way of knowing I was going to come out.
Before dawn on the morning of November 20th, 1943, the great Operation Helen invasion fleet was assembled 1 mile off the entrance to Tarawa's lagoon.
We bailed out about 2:30 in the morning, I guess, and the ship was all secure, so we had to go up and down ladders and through different compartments to get to the mess hall, where we were served steak and eggs, a traditional breakfast of troops as they prepare to go into combat. And then after breakfast, we went topside and waited with full equipment and waited for our boat assignment to be called.
And when we got to Tarawa, some people call it Tarawa, I call it Tarawa. We, of course, had the Navy start bombarding this island, shelling it, and Navy planes were bombing. And at this time, of course, I sort of had a feeling that I felt sorry for the Japanese. I thought we were wiping them out.
We was all afraid there wasn't going to be anything left the way they were bombarding, and we thought it was going to be sunk, but we got there, it wasn't.
We were standing there on the rail of the ship, and we saw splashes in the water, and we thought, well, perhaps they were porpoise or something, and in a few minutes a shell comes screaming through the rigging of the Xylan, and of course 4 or 5 of us wound up in the paint locker, and I wound up with 2 skinned knees. Then we realized that the island wasn't secure, that there was some opposition.
At 0700, 2 minesweepers, the requisite and pursuit, supported by the destroyers Ringgold and Dashiell, came through this reef channel to clear the lagoon of mines. Behind them came the churning Amtraks. As a forewarning of the devastation to come, the Ringgold took 3 hits from the Japanese shore batteries.
When we left the ships, we went over the side, over the nets, down the nets into the landing craft at about 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning. And because we had to go down in shifts, we spent a lot of time what we call rendezvousing. That was the amphibious craft were just circling around the vessel until everyone was off of the ship and into their respective boats. And then we proceeded to what's called the line of departure. And we also met the amphibious tractors there, where the troops were transferred out of the boats into the amphibious tractors for the first 2 waves.
At 0855, the 2nd Regiment Scout and Sniper Platoon under William Dean Hawkins and the engineers under the command of Lieutenant Alan Leslie landed here at the end of a long pier that used to extend 500 yards into the lagoon. They were the first to discover the appalling truth that instead of the low neap tide, an even lower dodging tide had left the inner reef almost bare. The incredible discovery came too late. For 15 minutes later, the first assault wave of 42 Amtraks ground onto the reef, and Admiral Shibasaki's Imperial Marines opened up with devastating fire.
We landed around 9 o'clock in the morning. On the way in, the tractor on the left was hit right dead center with an anti-boat gun, 47 millimeter. Stopped it, that put us on the extreme left flank when we landed. We stopped there and we was floating in a shell hole where a 16-inch shell had hit, and our tractor was sunk by a grenade. We stayed there in the tractor for just a small time when the Japs were throwing grenades back at us, and we was throwing them back.
We went over the side, and if you've ever had any experience with rifle ranges and been down in the pits when you have rapid fire going on, popping of bullets, it sounded like there was one about every square inch. We went over the side of the Amtrak and hit the deck. The Amtrak backed out. About that same time, there was a huge explosion, and fire and debris was coming down all around us. Some of it may have hit me, I don't recall. But at that moment, I knew I was dead.
In that hike for 600 yards across that water was probably the most devastating event any of us ever experienced in our lives. We were absolutely exposed. We were, in the vernacular, setting ducks. The enemy was firing at us. We could not fire back. And we just had to literally wade into their gunfire, into their muscles. And just hope that somehow or another the good Lord wouldn't let the bullets hit us. Unfortunately, in my particular platoon, by the time we made it to the reef, we had lost well over half of our people.
And the first Marine that I saw killed on the beach was a boy was loading his M1 with a clip of ammunition. He was looking at his rifle, and a grenade come down below his head, and he didn't even see the grenade. And when that grenade went off and blew his head off, then I really started getting jittery.
I can remember thinking, I wonder where I'll be the safest. If I should get clear down in the water, or if I should get up higher so I could walk faster. And we just kept on going until we got ashore.
When I saw all the Marines laying out there, and I thought maybe they were just flaked out. And I told one of these buddies, I said, look at all those guys crapped out there. Why are they crapped out? And he said, they're not crapped out, they're dead. And that really woke me up to what I'd gotten myself into. And it's awakening.
There were a lot of wounded Marines and dead bodies floating in the water. And I was in the water, and I came up on one Marine. He'd been shot right between his both eyes. He'd lost his eyesight. And of course, blood was just pouring out, and he wanted help. And there was nothing I could do. I was leading about 150 Marines behind me, and I couldn't help the poor fellow. But I was yelling for a corpsman. You know, eventually they get to him, but I'll never forget that, and I've often wondered if the old boy died in the water.
But we came into the seawall, or I came into the seawall. There were a lot of guys hunkered down, and anybody sticking their head up over the top got shot.
Aboard the command ship Maryland, confusion reigned supreme. The intensive firing of the 16-inch guns had jarred the radio equipment, causing intermittent communications with the attacking Marines. The first message from shore was a chilling one. Have landed. Unusually heavy opposition. Casualties 70%. Can't hold. Disorganized and unable to advance against the enemy fire, the Tarawa veterans can vividly recall their individual baptisms of fire.
So I look out and I spot this sniper. So I take my rifle, my good old M1, and I line it up against the corner and the pillbox, and everything's classic. You take your deep breath, you let half of it out, and then you squeeze it off. Now, I tumble that rascal. I'm back at high port with my rifle, gloating, I suppose. And this person standing at the pillbox looking out towards the ocean, he said, "You SOB, you shot me." And what had happened, actually, was on your M1 rifle, your bolt action, it has a little handle up there, you load it. And it's a piece of metal, as part of the bolt, is maybe a 1/2 inch or 1/3 of an inch wide and maybe 4 inches long. A second sniper had hit that little piece on my rifle. It ricocheted up and hit this kid right in the middle of his forehead. Well, someplace in our great nation today, there's some old Marine with a Purple Heart and a scar on his forehead because of me.
By individual acts of bravery, small groups of Marines were able to breach the seawall defenses.
Well, we went over the wall, right into some trenches where some dead Japs were, but a few of them weren't, who were back in the side. One of them came out with a rifle, shot the fellow right next to me on my right, and we threw a charge in where he went, and a buddy of mine with a flamethrower, he put the flamethrower in there, and a couple of them came out the other side, and they were taken care of by other Marines on the other, from where we were.
By dusk of the first day, the Marines' advance could be measured in feet and yards. Most were still pinned on the beach. Day 2, 8th Marine reinforcements hit the deadly inner reef. Of the 199 men in the first wave, only 90 reached shore.
And I was right in the bow of the landing craft. My lieutenant was on the other side, and I stepped out, and I was in probably hitting deep water, and I couldn't even see the seawall. Somebody, I've read books, said we was 600 yards, some said 500, some 400, some says 800, but man, it's a long ways. You can't believe it. And the Japs are shooting at us. And by the time we got to the beach, we didn't have a handful of Marines in my company.
At the time I got to the beach and could get roll call or find out who I had left, out of my 41 men, I'd had 18 killed going in.
I still recall seeing the machine gun bullets bouncing off the water. They were firing short of the line I was in, and you could actually see the machine gun bullets hit the water, and you could hear them zing over your head. So I kept a pretty good eye on where these bullets were hitting, and when they got fairly close, I would go underwater, and I suppose I made 10 or 12 feet progress toward the island, and I would come up and get a gasp of air or two, and then I would go back underwater. I suppose it took me maybe an hour and a half or 2 hours to cover the 600 yards. I really had no way of gauging time.
Now reinforced, the beached Marines charged a determined enemy.
And the lieutenant says, send the scouts out over the seawall and let's go. Let's get even with the Japs. And so I had a scout in that platoon from West Virginia by the name of Jones. He threw his rifle up on the seawall, and where he went, and they blew him back. They blew him past where we standing. And he must have had 25 holes in him.
If I could go back to when we got out of the reef, there were, as I said, there were some Japanese soldiers aboard this old ship firing at us, and our dive bombers came down, dive bombing the ship, and they would let a string of bombs go, and half the bombs would hit the ship, and half the bombs would fall among us. So I thought at the time that they had to do something about the Japanese soldiers on the ship, but that was probably my first 5 minutes in combat, and I learned that war is a pretty callous, unfeeling business.
So we went to an amphibious tractor that had part of the bow up on the seawall, and we got on the downhill side, run up the track and over the seawall and across the sand, and we finally got a chance to fight.
As the Marines advanced, tiny Bayshore erupted in a volcanic explosion of lead and steel. The tiny 291-acre island was an arena of death as the Marines closed on the determined foe.
At the end of the pier, where all these dead guys and wounded guys were, it was unbelievable. And we didn't have enough means to get them back to the ships. And here I went down there, and here's one of these guys shot real bad. He'd been his insides and back, and he's blown all to pieces, but he's still alive. It was really a dogfight in true sense, because nobody give any quarter. You either killed the guy or got killed. It was just that simple.
We would take the machine guns and keep fire on the apertures of the pillboxes. And then the flamethrower boys would go up with the demolition board while we kept fire in the aperture of the pillbox. And then they would put the charges in there and blow them up and set the flame in there.
In the smoke and haze of battle, the Marines made a torturous advance against the fanatical Japanese troops. At times, the fighting was so close that no telephoto lenses were needed to film the enemy. But open targets were rare. The island was infested with buried pillboxes and bunkers, and snipers in coconut trees took a heavy toll.
They were an invisible enemy. You could see their gunfire. You could see the muzzle blast through the coconut logs, and that's what we shot at.
We were advancing from little trench to trench and foxhole to foxhole to the Japs, making pretty good progress, and suddenly there was a Jap, I don't know where he came from. He jumped up or came running by me, and I wasn't too familiar with my carbine. I intended to take it off safety. Instead of that, I pushed the magazine release, and there I was unarmed, but the Jap was running the other direction, and my runner was yelling, "Shoot him, shoot him, shoot him." So I turned around and said, "Why didn't you shoot him?" He said, "I never thought about it."
In my Marine Corps earlier days, I was always taught to, when you're looking around, get your view on what you want to see, and then duck down and come up in another place. And this I had just done, and I started to duck down when, wham, a bullet hit me and went right through the helmet. So anyway, all it did was it cut a little place on top of my head, and I went over to Corpsman, and they put a little bandage on it, and I was back in action again.
It was from this two-story bomb-proof that Admiral Shibasaki commanded his forces. Near dusk of the second day's combat, Major Jim Crow called for naval support to level the blockhouse. A destroyer came in close to the reef and opened fire with its 5-inch guns. 80 rounds pounded the concrete fortress, but with walls 5 feet thick, the bomb-proof held. Within the concrete bastion, Admiral Shibasaki knew the end was near, and he wrote his last message to the Imperial High Command. Our weapons have been destroyed, and from now on, everyone is attempting a final charge. May Japan exist for 10,000 years. About 0900 the next morning, the Marines attacked the bomb-proof with everything they had, and the Japanese responded with savage fury, since the blockhouse was the heart of their defenses. In the midst of this deadly carnage, Lieutenant Alexander Bonnyman led a group of engineers on an assault which gained the roof of the fortress. The enemy launched a frenzied counterattack, but the engineers beat them off with withering fire. Bonnyman died of his wounds, but the bomb-proof had been captured. The Japanese defenders poured from the exits, only to be cut down by murderous fire. Inside, Admiral Shibasaki and 200 men still held out. Bulldozers were called in to seal up the exits and gun ports. On the roof, Marines poured gasoline down the air vents and dropped in hand grenades. Explosions and muffled screams pierced these 5-foot walls.
By day 3, with heavy weapons now ashore, the fortified enemy positions collapsed one by one under the Marines' assault. Some Japanese troops chose suicide rather than surrender, while others fought to the death with fierce determination. Many had to be dug out of their underground bunkers. The first Japanese prisoners of the 5,000 troops of the Sasebo and the Yokosuka Special Naval Landing Forces, only 17 survived the Holocaust of Beisho.
In 72 hours, the carnage was over, and on devastated Beisho, young Marines gradually recovered from the hypnotic days of battle. The reality of war now assaulted their senses, and the impact of those scenes will never go away.
The human mind, I guess especially mine, wants to forget the bad things. That was a pretty bad thing, and to me now, it almost seems like it probably didn't happen.
You didn't realize it until after it was over, all the friends that you lost, many of them. I'm talking about 100 or better that I knew personally.
If you've ever been around death of that type, there's a definite odor, very strong odor, and there's blood, there's pieces and parts of people around, and you shouldn't become accustomed to that sort of thing. But after you have been through a battle like that, it's as you walk off, there's another part of us, I guess, that takes care of things like that and puts it someplace else.
The second day and the third day there, it was just the bloated bodies and everything started coming up, and the stench was, it was awful. You couldn't hardly breathe for it. But you learn to eat and live with it.
I talked to several pilots later on after we captured the airstrip that came in, and a lot of the pilots got airsick from coming in on their bombing raids. They'd be 1,000 feet in the air and they could smell the odor from the dead bodies. It was terrible. But you do get used to it. In fact, a buddy of mine and I were sitting on a little mound there about close to the end of the battle, and we were eating our lunch out of a little tin can, and I felt something move here in the sand, and I looked down, and the Japanese hand was coming up out of the sand, and this friend of mine, Bill Leonard, just took that old hand, pushed it back down the sand, and went on eating. It'll take your appetite.
I don't have no trouble with this until my mind digs it up. Then it bothers me, because we had lots of good Marines, And you don't understand how come you can stand by them and they are killed and you're alive. That part bothers me. Still bothers me.
But after the battle was over and we gathered together the remnants of our survivors, I recall we walked out across the pier and the debris we were so decimated that we were immediately evacuated after the battle, on the fourth day. And I'll never forget standing on the pier and looking over the reef. I think every American ought to have to stand on that pier and look at the hundreds and thousands of dead, wounded people, destroyed ships, tractors, weapons, tanks upside down, to realize that the price of our freedom is not people with banners walking down streets talking about how badly they've been mistreated, but the young 19, 20-year-old Americans who through the centuries have done what their country asked them to do, who destroyed Hitler and Tojo and made it possible for us to have had 50 years on this earth without a global war. And when you stand and look at that debris and realize that every one of those bodies represents a human being just like you are, just like I am, and the world ends when the life goes out of your body or mine. There is no more democracy, there is no more social system, there is no more judicial system. The world is over when life is gone. And those 1,000 men who died there paid a sacrifice nobody can ever describe, because the world ended on that reef for them. That's why we're taking our monument back. And that's why we are real proud to have been companions with those men.
It is over. This band of brothers has fulfilled a pledge inscribed on the epitaph of Beisho's military cemetery in 1943. To you who lie within this coral sand, we who remain pay tribute to a pledge. That in dying, thou shalt surely not have died in vain. That when again bright morning dyes the sky, and waving fronds above shall touch the rain, we will remember.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.